Shalom everybody and greetings VFI news supporters and anyone else watching this report. It's been another amazing week here in Israel with the IDF heavily engaged in Gaza but also engaged in defending Israel from ballistic missiles fired by the Houthis in Yemen, airstrikes on Hezbollah operatives in Lebanon, and defending Druze civilians under attack in Syria. We're also facing the possibility of early elections as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is now governing at the head of a minority coalition in the Knesset after his ultra-Orthodox allies bolted over disagreements regarding the drafting of Haredi youth. All that and much more is just ahead on this week's edition of VFI News from Israel. Let's start with the top story from this last week, and that's the outbreak of violence in southern Syria, which drew Israel in and almost drew in world superpowers. I'd love to tell you how it all started, but first we need to set the stage. The city of Suwayda in southern Syria is the capital of Suwayda Governorate, a province in the southern part of the country adjacent to the Israeli border on Mount Hermon. The overwhelming majority of the region's nearly 700,000 residents belong to the Druze community, and these people are not Muslims. It's very important for you to understand that because so much of the reporting about this situation in the international media totally ignored it, and it's a very important point. The Druze are a religious sect distinct from Islam or any monotheistic religion. Not much is known about the tenets of their faith because it's very secretive and only the senior religious scholars are even allowed to read their sacred texts. Ordinary Druze people only know some basics, which means people like you and me only know these basics. As best as I've ever been able to piece together in my nearly 5 decades of living here in Israel, those tenets are similar to Unitarian Christianity in terms of an imperative to be kind and generous, the importance of family, and the honor of honest work, etc., etc. But there are also some more unique characteristics, such as, for starters, you can't convert to being Druze. Only the offspring of a Druze mother and a Druze father can be a Druze. This is somehow related to a belief in reincarnation, but we'll leave that aside for now. I think it's worth mentioning in this context that in Judaism, a person born to a Jewish mother is automatically Jewish, while being born to a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother gives one ties to the community, but doesn't automatically make you Jewish. Another basic tenet of the Druze religion is that they are descended from Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses. This is almost certainly not true, but once again, we'll leave it aside for now, as it is enough to know that the Druze are ethnically very closely related to Arab tribes which have lived in the Middle East for most of the last 2,000 years. I'm not aware if any genetic testing or anything like that has been done. If you know, tell us about it in the comments section. One more very important thing you need to know about the Druze is that they believe that if a Druze person is born in a certain country, then God put them there because he wants them to be a loyal and productive citizen of that country. Now, there are around 152,000 Druze in Israel, and they are the only non-Jewish demographic group that has its young men drafted into the IDF when they turn 18. This is the result of an agreement reached by the Israeli government and the Druze leadership in the immediate aftermath of the 1948 Independence War, in which the Druze sided with the Jews in fighting to establish this country. That was the beginning of a close bond between the Druze of Israel and the Jewish majority, which has had good results for everybody concerned. In fact, my first military commander was a Druze citizen. Now that brings us to the Druze who live in other countries in this region. Around 20,000 live in Jordan, 250,000 or so live in Lebanon, and around 700,000 live in Syria, once again mostly in the Suwayda governorate in the south. They are very loyal to their own country, but as we'll talk about more in a moment, they are also deeply attached to each other. Also, the Druze of Syria are beginning to waver in their loyalty to that state because the regime that currently rules there is deeply hostile to them, as we've seen graphically in recent days. Now, once again, let me get back to how all this started. The Druze of southern Syria were very loyal to the Assad regime, which ruled there for most of the last several decades. When that regime was overthrown last December by a coalition of Sunni jihadist groups led by HTS and their chieftain Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, many members of Syria's non-Sunni minority groups were very nervous. That nervousness proved to be well-founded, as al-Jolani's forces have carried out a campaign of harassment against these minorities, sometimes boiling over into murderous violence. This was the case in March when Alawite tribes in the coastal plain were violently attacked by the regime, and now last week, clashes broke out between Druze residents of Suwayda and some of their Sunni Bedouin neighbors. These clashes continued for several days and included massacres of entire Druze families as well as Christian communities in the area. Now, finally, the regime in Damascus said it was sending in forces to break up the fighting. But instead of being a neutral police force breaking up a fight, many of these forces actively joined the Bedouin gangs in attacking the Druze. Seeing this, the Druze community here in Israel demanded that the IDF intervene to save their brethren across the border. But the Israeli government had some very excellent reasons for hesitating. To start with, the Trump administration in the United States has taken several steps to try and entice the al-Jolani regime to become an ally of the West, and it seemed to be working. Now, large deals have recently been signed with Western firms with financing coming from the UAE and Saudi Arabia to repair the damage to Syria's infrastructure from the long civil war. The hope was, and still is, that Syria could rise from the ashes, boom economically, entice large numbers of Syrian refugees currently living in Europe and Turkey to return home. But the biggest strategic prize from America and Europe's point of view was the hope that Syria would flip from being an ally of Iran, to a lesser degree Russia, to being an enemy of Iran, who was also much less friendly towards Moscow. Once again, this big plan was beginning to show signs of coming together, and al-Jolani has even made some remarks which indicate that he'd be interested in joining the Abraham Accords and normalizing relations with Israel. But then, these clashes put all of that in jeopardy. And if you understand all that, you understand why Israel did not immediately send the IDF rolling across the border to defend the Druze of Suwayda, as obvious as the moral imperative to do so seemed to be. Instead, the Air Force launched some tepid airstrikes on some of the forces that were moving south toward Suwayda from Damascus. When that didn't seem to make much of an impression, the Air Force launched more robust strikes on these forces as well as regime assets in Damascus itself. There was a pretext for this that went beyond the desire of Israel to protect the Druze, as there were agreements in the past several months that the al-Jolani regime would not send strategic weapons like tanks and rocket launchers south of Damascus. Israel gave the regime all kinds of goodies in exchange for their assurances that they wouldn't do that, just by the way. And the Trump administration's lifting of Assad-era sanctions on Syria was also part of that arrangement. So when the regime broke their side of the agreement, it was no small thing, and it would have been a problem even if these forces had not participated in massacres of Druze civilians. But they did, and there's a tremendous amount of evidence that they did, which brings us to another story that is wrapped up inside this bigger story. Isn't this confusing for all of you? No, it shouldn't be. I'm just bringing you the truth from the Israel desk so that we can understand what's happening in the Middle East. Now, I'm talking about the press coverage of this event in the international media and the related issue of the UN statements about it. This coverage by the international media and the statements by the UN were almost universal in their condemnation of Israel for launching attacks against the Syrian regime. They were almost also universal in completely ignoring the regime's participation in the massacre of some of their very own citizens. It got so bad that even some commentators in Arab media outlets expressed their anger about this, and in fairness, I must point out that by the third day, some Western media outlets had begun to present a more complete picture of the situation. Still, the overall theme of this coverage was that Israel had mindlessly lashed out at a neighboring Arab country for no particular reason. Sometimes there might be an admission that Israel was taking advantage of an internal dispute there by claiming to care about one party in the dispute when everyone knows those horrible Israelis are a bunch of ethnocentric fascists who don't really care about anyone who isn't Jewish. Well, I'm only exaggerating a little bit here, friends, and it's a reminder, in case anyone needed one, that we're getting very close to the end of the age. Anti-Semitism is becoming at one and the same time so absurd and yet so normalized that the absurdity of it is barely even noticed anymore. Beyond that lies deceit and gaslighting are becoming more and more normative in the discourse between individuals and nations, and fewer people even care about the truth anymore. They don't even care that they don't care. It's a very bad situation, and it's a huge part of why the end times are going to be so scary. It's also a great way for believers to be a point of light in this growing darkness by sticking with the truth no matter what. Be truthful, friends, even if it costs you something, because that will make you stand out in this world and it will draw people to you and the gospel that you have to share. Another thing people will notice about you is if you buck the trend and support Israel and the Jewish people when so many others are opposing Israel and the Jewish people, often for utterly ridiculous reasons or for no particular reason at all. Now, one way you can do that is by supporting Vision for Israel, the organization I'm privileged to lead. The last 2 years have been very difficult here in Israel, and there's no reason to think it's going to get easier anytime soon. That's why here at Vision for Israel, we've got so many projects to provide humanitarian support to families and communities who just need help. And let me tell you, friends, there's hardly anyone in Israel who doesn't need help these days. And that's why our staff and the volunteers at our warehouse near Jerusalem are busy day and night, putting together parcels of food and household supplies to be delivered to families in distress. We're also providing school supplies to children right now, assistance to single mothers and Holocaust survivors, and much more. So please watch this short video to see how you can be part of making these projects happen. We all know that since October 7th, 2023, Israel has faced really tremendous challenges, not only because of the death and destruction that happened along the southern border of Israel in many of our communities, but also across the northern border, to where at one point we had over 100,000 Israeli residents and citizens, both Jews and Arabs alike, who had to evacuate their homes. So it's been a very multi-layered challenge in order to meet the needs of the people of Israel. And that's where Vision for Israel has come to the forefront, networking together across the country with as many others as possible in order to meet the needs of people. And this is all from both security concerns to safety concerns to welfare concerns to even to the children who have lost their education and schooling. Welcome back, friends. Now I want to conclude this story about the attacks on the Druze community in southern Syria by telling you that the Druze in Israel did more than just petition their own government to intervene. Over 1,000 young Druze men from Israel decided to literally take matters into their own hands, grabbing whatever weapons they could find and crossing the border en masse to take up positions defending their brethren on the other side of the fence. I personally found this inspiring, but also terrifying. This could have gotten very badly out of hand very quickly, and I took the point of some Israeli officials who said that we simply can't afford to let private citizens take these kinds of steps because although we have our own Druze population populations here in Israel, we also have our own Bedouin and Sunni Arab populations. Should they be allowed to cross the border and join the fray too? Or maybe they'd prefer to just start fighting Druze people right here in Israel itself? Well, like I said, this sort of thing can quickly get out of hand, and I'm glad that at last, on Sunday evening and into Monday morning, the clashes in southern Syria began to dissipate, and the Bedouin tribesmen agreed to leave the Druze alone for now. But as they were leaving Suwayda, they were filmed by international media crews stealing everything that wasn't nailed down. This included household furniture, appliances, farming equipment, and even livestock. Pretty despicable if you ask me, and I'm sure it'll lead to more problems down the line. Well, for now, there are only scattered voices in the Syrian Druze community saying they'd like to be annexed by Israel, but I think those voices could get louder going forward. No matter what you or I might think about the idea, it is unlikely to happen for all kinds of reasons. There's no question that Israel is definitely trying to reinforce the Druze of southern Syria and offer them what protection they can, but annexing that territory would not be so simple, even if the people who live there said that that's what they wanted. So in the meantime, the IDF has already delivered large shipments of humanitarian aid to Suwayda, and I suspect that there might be something else getting delivered. For most of the last 22 months, we've seen and heard reports about the IDF capturing large stockpiles of weapons, ammunition, and military equipment from Hamas in Gaza, and even more so from Hezbollah warehouses in southern Lebanon. I always thought that all that stuff was being quietly passed along to Americans so they could be given to the Ukrainians. But it turns out that much of it is still sitting in IDF warehouses all over Israel. So will the IDF give it to the Druze in southern Syria so they can be ready for the next attack against them? We might be able to find out about it soon. Well, now let's switch our gaze to the conflict in Gaza Strip. The short version of this story is that the IDF continues to clobber Hamas on the ground, while Hamas leaders continue to refuse to compromise in negotiations towards releasing the remaining Israeli hostages and ending the war. Well, the rest of the people of Gaza are paying a terrible price for whatever Hamas thinks it's getting out of this obstinate strategy, and the IDF also continues to suffer a steady drip of casualties. I wish I could tell you that there's likely to be a resolution to this terrible situation soon, but I'm afraid I can't do that. There is a stalemate whereby the IDF continues to inflict large numbers of casualties on Hamas and take small but tragic numbers of casualties, while the ordinary people of Gaza continue to suffer tremendously, and Hamas doesn't care anything about it. Until Hamas starts to care, or can somehow be compelled to start caring, or they're overthrown, I don't see anything changing in this situation. They hold the hostages, whose release is the key to ending this conflict. And until they are somehow compelled or convinced to release those hostages, the IDF will continue to attack and destroy them. There is one other story within this larger situation which bears mentioning, and that is about a group in Gaza calling itself Abu Shabab, composed of a small but growing number of mostly young men who are fed up with the situation and are ready to take on Hamas for control of the Strip. Israel is reportedly supplying these guys with light arms and ammunition, as well as intelligence support so they can try and get an advantage over Hamas. They have no love for Israel, but they do blame Hamas for starting this war and for keeping it going long after it should have ended, leading to the destruction of Gaza and the loss of many lives. These guys want to try and drive Hamas out of Gaza, I'm all for it, and take over the administration of it itself. And Israel is trying to help them do that. I don't know how this will end, and there are already some voices warning that Abu Shabab is little more than a street gang which could be co-opted by Iran to become a threat to Israel in the future, just like Hamas already is now. In any case, they are an enemy of Hamas right now, and they're willing to chase them down into the tunnels underneath Gazan cities, which is something the IDF would prefer not to have to do. I'm not sure how to advise you to pray about all this, but please continue to pray for the return of our Israeli hostages, which, as I said, is the key to ending this war, at least as far as Israel is concerned. Speaking of the end to the wars, despite getting absolutely clobbered by Israel in last year's short but intense conflict within the larger conflict, Lebanon's Hezbollah is not ready to hand over its weapons to the Lebanese National Army. This is what is being insisted upon by the Americans and the Europeans, who are giving Hezbollah a deadline to hand over all the remaining heavy weapons in their arsenal, or the green light will be given to Israel to destroy it in airstrikes. The implication is that the Americans, Europeans, and Israelis know where all these weapons are, including stockpiles of rockets and missiles, drones, mortars, etc. Hezbollah can either hand it all over to the Lebanese National Army, or they can watch it go up in poof, smoke. The only thing they can't do is keep it, but that's what they want to do, according to General Secretary Naim Qassam of Hezbollah, who gave the reason why in a recent speech where he said, "Hezbollah will not be humiliated." If I can switch to commentary mode for a moment, this is Barry talking now. This is yet another example of a phenomenon I've talked about before in these reports and in other venues, whereby here in the Middle East there's a great importance attached to honor and shame, saving face and refusing to admit to having made a mistake or suffered a defeat. The element that ties all of this together is pride, and the Bible says that God hates pride, probably because it does so much harm to the children that he created and he loves. I've lived long enough to see pride take down several great men and women. I've seen it destroy the lives of talented artists and gifted politicians. I've seen it tear apart ministries, congregations, organizations, companies, families, and even whole nations. And when I look at all that, it's no mystery why God hates pride so much. The leaders of Hezbollah, the Ayatollah regime in Tehran, and many others in the Middle East and beyond should swallow their pride and admit that they've made mistakes and stop doubling down on their mistakes. Hezbollah should have agreed to give up its rockets, missiles, drones, and so on a long time ago. They should have stopped defying the living God by threatening to destroy Israel, which the Bible calls the apple or the pupil of God's eye, a long time ago. Iran should stop making that same mistake, and so should many others. God allowed the Jewish people to return to their ancient homeland for a reason, and part of that reason was that he wanted this country to be a blessing to all the surrounding nations. Israel could have been a blessing to them by teaching them how to produce abundant crops even in the desert, how to make the best use of scarce water resources, and much more. There's still a chance for all of this, as the countries which have joined the Abraham Accords seem to have figured out. But it will require a lot of people to swallow their pride. It will require them to admit that the narratives about God rejecting the Jews and giving his blessings to others that they've been passing down from one generation to the next for generations are now false. It will require them to admit their forefathers made a mistake by trying to destroy Israel in generations past, and they need to stop making that same mistake if they want their children to have a better life. Now we're almost out of time, but there's one more group of people who should really stop wasting money and other resources attacking Israel and use that money and resources to fix what's wrong with their own country instead, and that's the Houthis in Yemen. Over the past week, they continued to fire ballistic missiles at Israel, compelling us once again to run to the bomb shelters late at night to avoid the risk of being fatally or even seriously wounded. This threat of incoming missiles and rockets is one that Israel will probably be grappling with for a very long time. And that's why here at Vision for Israel, we're continuing to raise money to place portable bomb safety shelters in public places all over the country, including in front of schools, community parks, sports fields, at bus stops, and more. So please watch this short video about this very important project. Vision for Israel has been installing bomb safety shelters since actually around the fall of 2021. During that year, there was a barrage of rockets that came into southern Israel, particularly by the terrorist group known as Hamas, and Israel had to find a way further in order to protect its citizens, its residents across the southern part of Israel. And so we sprung into action. We felt like this was a project that we had a personal invitation to fulfill. And it's important because when these projectiles, these missiles, these rockets, whatever that is that's thrown at Israel by its enemies, there is not only the potential for somebody being killed instantly, but also there's tremendous collateral damage and people that get wounded even from shrapnel. And so if you place a safety shelter at a bus stop, or in front of a high school or community center or a kindergarten or any kind of facility that's publicly accessible, the people can run into these shelters. The children can run and find safety in them and be protected from a rocket that lands and shrapnel is scattered, which could be mortally wounding people. So it gives not only a physical protection of security, but also an emotional sense of security that you know having a shelter that you can run to in the street, outside of a store, somewhere publicly accessible, not just in someone's home, but out in the open, gives a sense of security. And I always believe that it's important for us to refer to Scripture. And Psalm 91, the whole chapter talks about God providing us a shelter. And we have seen amazing deliverances from enemy rockets as a result. And now we've installed over 400 shelters across the southern and northern borders of Israel. And they weigh 30,000 kilos each, or that's 30 tons. And it's a lot of weight on rebar and concrete that's been specially mixed, and also with a special metal ramp that allows physically impaired people to be able to come up in a walker or a wheelchair on a moment's notice. In many of these areas, residents don't have any longer than between 5 seconds to maximum 45 seconds to get into a shelter to be protected. Welcome back, friends. We're almost out of time, and I want to continue the tradition of ending these reports with some good news. So here it is. The governing coalition in the Knesset, led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who I have great respect for, but is hanging by a thread, and we're more likely than not to be heading to fresh elections soon. Now, some wonder why this is good news, but my reason for saying it's good news is simply because we need new elections in Israel and new policies, especially when it comes to the draft of Haredi people, because we have a shortage in the IDF of good fighting soldiers and good thinkers, of which they are. Now, a lot has changed since the last elections, and many of the policies pursued by this current coalition are not what the people who voted for them in the last election thought they were voting for. I try to stay neutral on this show as much as I can, but what I just said is the objective truth, and I won't take it back. I also won't tell you who I'm planning to vote for in the upcoming elections, but I will tell you I think it's time for some serious changes in this country, and I know I'm not the only one. So on that note, I'm Barry Segal, and this has been another edition of VFI News from Israel. Shalom, shalom. I love you all out there. God bless you.